They told him America was a brutal cage of steel and fire, a place where a wounded enemy soldier would be left to perish. But when Corporal Klaus Richter was captured in 1944, his terrifying journey ended not with chains or neglect, but with a pristine white cot and a rare golden substance that was saving American lives. A miracle that cost the enemy everything to give. The air tasted of cordite and pulverized stone, hanging thick and yellow over the shattered Norman landscape as the final desperate volleys of machine gun fire tore through the hedgerows. 21-year-old Corporal Klaus Richter moved through it with the numb precision of a soldier pushed beyond the breaking point. Then, the world contracted to a single, explosive crack in his lower leg, dropping him instantly into the mud. His trouser leg was already darkening, the iron scent of blood mixing instantly with the stench of decay. Klaus knew the sound of bone giving way, and he knew the terrifying limits of wartime medicine. Slow, septic failure was his most likely fate. He dragged himself backward, his teeth grinding against the wave of agony, but the American advance was relentless. Before he could resist capture, a heavy boot nudged his rifle away. He braced for the cruelty he had been promised, but instead, an American soldier cut away the fabric around the injury, examining the wound with detached urgency. Minutes later, Klaus was on a stretcher being carried through the dust toward the back lines, his leg already burning with the ominous heat of a worsening infection. The transport was rough, jostling him endlessly in the back of a jeep, then onto a ship, crossing the cold, dark ocean to America, a land he expected to be a vast, unforgiving cage. Every jolting mile increased the threat of septicemia. His fear was absolute, fueled by years of government propaganda that painted Allied captors as soulless industrialists, capable only of calculating profit from human misery. He had heard the horrific stories whispered in the trenches, tales of prisoners being left exposed to the elements or used for painful labor until their bodies gave out. As the jeep tires spun on the wet earth, Klaus felt the intense throbbing of his fracture, certain that this pain was the preamble to a slow, calculated demise. He had performed his duty, and now, he assumed, the enemy would perform theirs. The ship's horn boomed across the Atlantic, carrying the severely wounded to a country entirely untouched by aerial combat or scorched earth. Klaus's leg, wrapped thickly in field dressings, burned with the unmistakable heat of a worsening infection. Yet, his fear of physical assault was increasingly replaced by the puzzle of his escorts. The American military police guards checked his wound with efficient regularity. They offered him a small tin canteen of cool water, and on a particularly cold night, one of them threw a thick, scratchy wool blanket over him. These small acts were not kindness, but a chilling display of routine decency. He kept waiting for the mask of professionalism to drop and the promised brutality to emerge. But the decency persisted. After what felt like 3 days, the train finally slowed into the massive, organized complex of Camp Concordia, Kansas. As Klaus was lifted out onto a waiting stretcher, the pain in his leg became a roaring siren. He saw rows of barracks and administrative buildings startlingly clean and orderly. He was wheeled into a long, quiet structure with screened windows, the camp infirmary. This was not the chaotic, crowded pen he had been promised. He was slid onto a clean, white-sheeted cot, his fever burning, his wound increasingly perilous. He had survived the front lines only to face a slower, more terrifying end in an unfamiliar land, or so he believed. The journey across the American interior had been a baffling contradiction. Untouched farmlands, vast highways, and cities that showed no signs of bombing or rationing. This untouched prosperity suggested a national resource base that staggered the imagination, a kind of effortless power that the beleaguered Reich could no longer muster. He watched the guards converse with easy, casual authority, their uniforms neat, their boots polished. This was not the image of the desperate criminal nation he had been promised. Their efficiency in processing the wounded was unsettling. It hinted at a system too robust to bother with petty cruelty. Now, lying on a spotless cot, surrounded by the scent of antiseptic, the reality of his surroundings felt fundamentally dishonest. The infirmary was a startling study in organization. Long rows of cots separated by thin screens, air smelling faintly of antiseptic and new cotton, and quiet professionalism reigning. This was a functioning, highly organized military hospital, and it was the most unsettling thing Klaus had encountered. As he was moved onto a clean bed, Dr. Eleanor Vance, wearing a simple white uniform, approached his cot. She examined him, her touch firm and clinical. A young nurse who spoke halting German translated her findings. The infection was deep, rooted in the fractured bone, and the fever was dangerously high. The interpreter repeated Dr. Vance's assessment of the gravity of the situation, confirming Klaus's deepest fear. Amputation was a strong possibility. But Dr. Vance's next words were a complete contradiction of his expectation. She spoke of a treatment regimen, mentioning a new guarded course of potent antibacterial agents. Klaus caught the English word that the translator did not bother with: penicillin. The German nurse leaned in and whispered to Klaus, "The doctor is taking a risk. She is ordering a powerful new substance." The simple fact that his life was being taken seriously, that a dedicated physician was allocating a highly valued commodity to save his leg and his existence, was a shock more profound than any physical pain. The American medical staff was preparing to deploy their most scarce, life-preserving material on a man who had been fighting against them. He had been prepared to face a brutal end at the hands of savages, but instead he was receiving the scientific cutting edge of the enemy. He tried to rationalize the situation, concluding that the Americans must be planning to use him for forced labor, requiring a healthy body for maximum output. That was the only logical explanation for this incredible expenditure. Yet, the nurse's hushed tone suggested this was an exception, a moral gamble by the doctor, not standard procedure. The sheer whiteness of the sheets, the consistent water pressure in the sink he could glimpse, the unhurried way Dr. Vance consulted her charts, all spoke of resources in vast surplus, resources the Reich desperately needed. This was not the work of a defeated or desperate nation. This was the work of an industrial giant, and its dedication to medical ethics felt almost perverse in the context of total war. His entire belief system was being challenged by a simple doctor's order. This story of unexpected kindness is just one chapter in a forgotten history. If you want more true, unbelievable tales of humanity breaking through the brutality of war, hit subscribe. The intense, relentless throb of the wound became Klaus Richter's sole anchor in reality, a burning rhythm that measured the infection's swift progress. Yet even through the haze, the sound of hushed German voices from the neighboring cots managed to penetrate his consciousness. The prisoners whispered about the miraculous antibacterial preparation the Americans possessed, a substance so valuable that it was strictly rationed for their own wounds. Klaus clung to the belief that he would never receive it. The rhythmic squeak of a medical cart's wheels announced their arrival. Dr. Vance approached with two nurses. In her hand, she held the syringe, the glass barrel shining. Inside, the unmistakable amber liquid, the mythical penicillin, looked impossibly small yet impossibly powerful. A nurse, a young woman with a steady hand, prepared the injection site. Klaus flinched, expecting the sudden painful lunge of contempt. Instead, the nurse spoke a quiet, simple German word. "Entspannen? Relax." Her voice was soft, her movement practiced and careful. The needle entered and the cool liquid began its slow push into his system. Klaus watched the amber receding in the syringe, his mind racing. This was not neglect. This was an enormous, incomprehensible investment of American wealth and science into the failing body of a common German soldier. Why were they wasting this miracle therapeutic compound on him? He searched Dr. Vance's face, seeking some sign of mockery, but found only the grave neutrality of a person focused entirely on the complex machinery of the human body. The intense, localized throbbing in his leg was now accompanied by an odd, unexpected sense of hope. The propaganda machine that had sustained him through the war had just been challenged by a single, small needle filled with an essential biological substance. The injection itself was painless, clean, and delivered with a surgical lack of personal engagement, yet it was the most emotionally charged moment of his captivity. It was a tangible violation of the rules of warfare as he understood them. He tried desperately to find the flaw in the logic, Perhaps the injection was merely a powerful painkiller designed to keep him quiet until the amputation. But the German whispers about the mold miracle confirmed that this was something exponentially more valuable. As the nurses left, the silence of the ward seemed to magnify the question. If the enemy was this efficient and this ethically bound, what chance did his own side truly have? The initial fear of cruelty was replaced by the deeper, more unsettling fear of overwhelming moral superiority. The change arrived not with a sudden flash, but with the subtle, profound sensation of the fever finally breaking, a cold, saturating sweat that left Corporal Klaus Richter weak, yet strangely cleansed, after days spent trapped in a searing delirium. He woke to the blessed realization that the intense, throbbing agony in his leg had receded, replaced by a dull, manageable ache, a quiet sign that the tide had turned in his desperate internal battle. The infection, which German medics had been nearly helpless to prevent or treat, was visibly retreating. The scent in the ward, which had been thick with the cloying odor of decaying tissue, began to shift. The potent substance delivered in that small glass syringe was working, performing the miracle that his own nation's military medicine could not. When the German-speaking nurse returned, Klaus managed to ask the question, "What was it?" The nurse gently explained that it was called penicillin, a therapeutic compound, guarded more closely than gold, reserved for the Allies. The words landed on Klaus like artillery fire. This was the scientific cutting edge of the enemy, and it was being deployed to save his life. A profound and unsettling moral dilemma began to take root in his mind. The Reich had guaranteed American moral bankruptcy, yet here was the irrefutable evidence, a nation that, even in the middle of a global conflict, upheld a code that placed the value of human existence, even that of a wounded enemy, above the value of a desperately needed military resource. He searched for the catch, the condition, the ulterior motive, but the clean sheets and the receding fever offered no answer. He was alive because his enemies saw him not as a uniform, but as a patient. The act of saving his life was far more destructive to his former beliefs than any physical punishment could have been. The speed of his recovery was astonishing, a testament to the power of the medicine. Klaus stared at the healthy color returning to his skin, absorbing the fact that his survival was a direct result of American ingenuity and adherence to a moral standard. He felt a searing, painful gratitude, recognizing that this act of mercy was costing the lives of American soldiers on other fronts. The burden of this debt was heavier than the fear of amputation had ever been. He had been taught that enemies are mercilessly exploited. Instead, he was the beneficiary of an expensive, guarded asset. The simple physical reality of his healing leg was the most comprehensive rebuttal of propaganda imaginable, forcing him to question every premise of the war he had fought. A rare quiet settled over the infirmary late one afternoon as Dr. Eleanor Vance paused by Klaus Richter's bedside. Klaus, emboldened by the miraculous retreat of his illness and the sheer weight of his moral confusion, seized the moment. He asked the question that had been tormenting him. Why? Why spend their most valuable life-saving preparation, a substance so scarce it was reserved for their own, on an enemy combatant who had worked to secure their downfall? Dr. Vance listened patiently. She explained that the moment he was captured, he ceased to be a soldier and became a patient. "The war stops at the hospital door," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I am a doctor. My duty is to preserve life and alleviate suffering, regardless of uniform. That is the Hippocratic Oath. We are not saving you because you are a German. We are saving you because you are a person whose life can be saved." Her explanation was a profound display of moral confidence. It suggested that the United States did not need to resort to cruelty or selective neglect to prove its power. The enemy was a system that upheld a universal code of decency, even at high cost. The life-saving compound he had received was not a sentimental gift. It was the practical application of this moral law. Before she moved on, Dr. Vance asked Klaus about his family, mentioning her own younger brother who was serving in the Pacific, a small, brief personal connection that chipped away at the massive wall separating them. He was physically confined, but his mind had been unexpectedly freed by an act of unsentimental compassion. The Americans had not simply healed his wound, they had given him a new, bewildering perspective on the moral architecture of the world. She stressed that the United States military was bound by international law, yes, but also by its own self-image, a nation that did not descend to the level of its adversaries. This adherence to principle, even for the enemy, struck Klaus as an almost terrifying form of strength. It was the strength of resources, discipline, and ideology combined. He realized that this commitment to dignity was arguably a more powerful tool than any weapon, winning the loyalty of the mind long after the battlefield was cleared. The brief human moment shared between them, acknowledging the shared cost of the conflict, cemented the lesson. The people involved were human, and their system operated on an elevated code. He carried her words, "The war stops at the hospital door," as a moral compass. The moral lines of war are often blurred. What is your reaction to the Allied policy of giving precious, life-saving penicillin to enemies, prisoners of war? Share your thoughts on this surprising act of decency in the comments below. The moment Klaus Richter took his first few tentative steps out of the infirmary bed was a victory not just of medicine, but of morality. The muscles were weak, but the bone was healing, the tissue clean, a testament to the power of the therapeutic agent and the principles of Dr. Vance. Discharged from the hospital ward, Klaus was transferred to the main barracks, where he began his phase of recovery and reorientation. He saw the camp's library, stocked with donated books. The entire experience was a constant, active refutation of the propaganda that had conditioned him since childhood. He had been taught that Americans were soft, undisciplined, and morally corrupt. Yet every day he saw evidence of organizational genius, unwavering discipline, and a moral framework that prioritized humanitarianism. The systematic kindness of the Americans was the greatest shared astonishment. The library books, the clean food, the calm guards, each item was a weapon of decency actively disproving a specific Nazi propaganda point. One afternoon, while limping toward the mess hall, Klaus saw a young American nurse who offered him a small, worn paperback book, a collection of stories by Mark Twain. "For your English practice," she said. Klaus felt a strange swell of emotion. The book was a tiny, tangible symbol of the cultural bridge being built. He realized that the Americans were not just treating his physical injury. They were subtly treating the spiritual injury inflicted by the war. He no longer felt like a discarded piece of enemy hardware. He was a man with a future, a man given a second chance, purchased by the therapeutic excellence of the very nation he had been fighting. He quickly realized the immense logistical effort required to keep 400,000 prisoners of war healthy, fed, and engaged. The food was not spectacular, but it was nutritious and plentiful, far exceeding the rations most of his family received back home. He watched the camp officers manage complex supply chains, schedule labor details, and even organize educational opportunities. This was not the work of a savage enemy. It was the work of an incredibly powerful, hyper-efficient state that did not let its principles slide, even in the mundane routines of warehousing its foes. He began spending hours with the English book, recognizing that mastery of this language was a key to understanding the culture that had saved him. The sudden, piercing clarity of recovery brought with it an unexpected emotional reckoning. Klaus Richter was alive, his leg whole, a feat of medicine achieved by his enemy, but the realization of this immense gift was soon accompanied by a staggering, overwhelming wave of guilt. One morning, while sitting in the recreation hall, Klaus saw a 3-day-old American newspaper reporting heavy Allied losses. The severity of the Allied losses in the European theater was unmistakable. He read the numbers and realized every ounce of the life-preserving liquid he received was paid for by the anguish of an American family. His survival felt unjust, a moral imbalance he could not correct. When he was assigned to light labor detail, repairing farm equipment in a large, airy camp workshop, Klaus attacked the task with frantic, almost desperate energy. He worked with a fierce dedication, trying to justify his life, to somehow earn the compassion that had been so freely bestowed upon him. One day, the ranch foreman, George, placed a simple peanut butter and jelly sandwich beside Klaus's workbench. "Slow down, son," George drawled. Klaus tried to explain his feelings, his need to show gratitude for the saving of his life, his sense of debt. George listened, then shrugged with a gentle smile. "Your job now is to get this equipment working. Your labor is your currency here. You want to thank us? Help us grow the food that feeds our boys overseas. That's all the payment anyone needs." The American system didn't want his emotional servitude, it wanted his honest work. This concept, the practical, high-minded form of trade, was another layer of bewilderment. His life, saved by an expensive therapeutic marvel, was valued as a unit of labor, contributing to the Allied war economy. The system that had rescued him from certain failure offered him a clean slate, asking only for effort in return. He finally understood that the debt was not personal, but systemic. He was a cog in a large, complex machine, and his job was to perform that function well. This realization was freeing. He was not a supplicant, he was a worker. The exchange was dignity for effort. He noticed the casual, egalitarian relationship between the American guards and the civilian foreman like George, a lack of rigid hierarchy that was also completely alien to his military training. This was a democracy of labor, a system where competence mattered more than rank. The simple act of fixing a tractor became a profound lesson in a different way of organizing society. The quiet ritual of writing letters home was one of the few tangible connections the prisoners had to the world they had left behind. Klaus sat on his bunk, the official stationery before him, wrestling with the immense difficulty of telling the truth. "I was gravely injured, and the Americans saved my life." He crumpled the paper. To his sister, steeped in the Reich's narratives of American medical cruelty, this would sound like forced testimony. He was forced into self-censorship, protecting his family not from the enemy's cruelty, but from the shock of the enemy's profound decency. He started a new page, carefully choosing words that communicated the underlying truth through descriptions of the physical. "I have been treated fairly, Liesel. The food is abundant. We have meat and bread every day. I am working now in a clean workshop. The land here is enormous and untouched by aerial attacks." He described the material abundance, the sheer scale of the American economy. He finished by mentioning his leg. "The injury is healing completely thanks to their dedicated doctors." He was in an active battle against censorship, not just the camps, but his sister's indoctrination. He used short, punchy phrases to describe the lies he must avoid. No mention of the miracle therapeutic compound. No praise from the doctors. Only facts so bland they might be believed. He was attempting to smuggle a tiny grain of truth past a fortress of misinformation. He had become a reluctant witness, tasked with carrying an unbelievable message back to a populace that desperately needed hope, but was conditioned to reject any narrative of American kindness. He knew that when he returned home, he would carry not the bitterness of defeat, but the astonishing memory of unsentimental compassion. The true work of rebuilding hearts would begin with simple, hard-won truths. He wondered if his sister would even understand the term clean workshop in a country where factories were reduced to smoking ruins. He focused on neutral, factual measurements: the number of meals, the size of the barracks, the endless miles of unmolested telephone lines he saw during transport. These details were objective reality, but collectively they painted a picture of competence and resources that utterly shattered the image of a chaotic, morally bankrupt opponent. He hoped that the underlying tone of peace and stability in his carefully constructed sentences would convey the unbelievable reality that he was safe, healthy, and treated with respect, a shocking contrast to the turmoil he knew his family was enduring. The air on the Kansas plains was electric with rumor, finally breaking one morning in May 1945 with the official, solemn announcement of Germany's surrender. For the prisoners at Camp Concordia, the news was received with a profound, stunned silence. Klaus Richter, fully recovered, sought out Dr. Eleanor Vance in the infirmary. She was busy organizing files, but she took a moment to look at him. Klaus managed a simple, heartfelt thanks, explaining that she had saved more than his leg. She had saved his perspective. "Go home, Corporal," she said quietly, "and remember what you learned here." The journey back across the Atlantic was agonizingly slow. When the troopship finally docked in the wreckage of a German port city, the sight was a devastating physical contrast to the functional abundance of Kansas. The docks were rubble, the city scarred. As he disembarked, Klaus held a small bundle of belongings, including the English grammar book, and wrapped in a handkerchief, a tiny empty glass vial. He framed the empty penicillin vial, the literal, tangible proof he carried through the ruins. He knew that this small object held more truth about the American spirit than 1,000 official treaties. He began working as a translator for the Allied Reconstruction Forces, often telling his story. He spoke not of battles, but of clean sheets, of abundant food, and of the doctor who used the most precious, scarce, antibacterial preparation to save the life of a foot soldier who had been her enemy. In 1949, Klaus opened a small technical training school, specializing in repairing farm equipment. Above his desk, he framed the empty vial and placed beside it a small photograph of Dr. Vance. When people asked, Klaus would explain, "That little glass container represents the only reason I am alive today. It taught me that the greatest power in the world is not the ability to destroy, but the courage to save." Klaus Richter became a quiet engine of reconciliation, one of thousands of former prisoners whose stories of professional decency and unexpected compassion formed the first vital moral bridge between the shattered German nation and the United States. His school thrived, becoming a beacon of practical recovery in a time of ideological ruin. Klaus often hired former German prisoners of war, creating a community founded on the shared understanding of American efficiency and fairness. These men carried the same lesson. The Allies had defeated Germany physically, but they had won the peace morally. The quiet spread of this truth, carried by thousands of repatriated soldiers, was recognized by historians as a crucial component of the successful post-war alliance. Klaus's life was no longer defined by the war he lost, but by the second chance he received, a second chance symbolized forever by that small, empty vial. Klaus's story shows that sometimes the most powerful weapons in war are decency and humanity. If you found this tale inspiring, please share it with someone who needs to hear a story of hope amidst conflict. If Klaus's story of unexpected grace in the face of war opened your eyes to a forgotten piece of history, give this video a like. And to ensure you never miss another unbelievable true story of humanity winning in the darkest times, be sure to subscribe right now.